When the temperature in the San Juan Mountains plummeted to 40 below, Abigail Fletcher's eccentric habit of hoarding raw wool and split cedar inside her living room stopped being a punchline. Within hours, that towering, chaotic pile of fleece and wood became the only barrier between her and certain death. To anyone else, the interior of Abigail Fletcher's A-frame cabin looked like the aftermath of a bizarre yard sale. Situated 15 miles outside the historic, rugged mining town of Silverton, Colorado, the cabin sat at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet. It was a place where winter didn't just arrive, it invaded. Abigail, a 42-year-old textile artist and former high school history teacher, had moved to the cabin 3 years prior, seeking refuge from a spectacular and exhausting divorce. Her ex-husband, Richard Sterling, had been a fastidious corporate litigator who categorized her creative chaos as a character flaw. When they split, Abigail retreated to the mountains, purchasing a deeply discounted, off-grid property bordered by miles of unforgiving San Juan National Forest. But Abigail carried a strange habit into her solitary mountain life, one that locals and passing hikers often found perplexing. She kept an absurd amount of raw, unwashed sheep's wool and split firewood directly inside her main living space. It wasn't just a basket of yarn or a neat little stack of logs by the hearth. Taking up an entire third of her open-plan living room were dozens of tightly packed burlap sacks, each bulging with greasy, lanolin-rich fleece sheared from merino and Navajo churro sheep. She bought the raw fleeces in bulk from a rancher down in the valley, intending to wash, card, and spin them over the long winters. Next to this mountain of wool was an imposing, almost structural wall of split cedar and oak. Rather than walking out to a woodshed in the freezing mornings, Abigail had spent the entire month of October hauling 2 full cords of wood directly into her house, stacking it floor to ceiling against the western wall. "You're going to attract mice, Abby," her closest neighbor, a retired structural engineer named Tom Abernathy, had warned her a few weeks earlier. Tom lived 5 miles down the mountain and occasionally checked in on her. "You've got a fire hazard and a rodent hotel in your living room." Abigail had just laughed, burying her hands in the dense, oily fibers of a fresh fleece. "It smells like the earth, Tom. And when the snow is waist deep, I won't have to put on my boots just to keep the stove fed." She didn't know it, but that stubborn refusal to conform to standard mountain living protocols was about to become the anchor of her survival. The warning signs of the storm began on a Tuesday in late January. Meteorologists in Denver were tracking an anomaly, a violent convergence of a moisture-heavy Pacific system and a brutal, plunging Arctic vortex from Canada. The local news stations dubbed it a bomb cyclone. But up on Red Mountain Pass, words like that rarely captured the reality of the violence to come. At 2 p.m., Abigail's weather radio crackled to life with a severe emergency broadcast. The National Weather Service wasn't just issuing a blizzard warning, they were declaring a state of emergency. Forecasters predicted wind gusts exceeding 90 miles per hour and localized snowfall of up to 50 inches within a 36-hour window. Worse, ambient temperatures were projected to freefall to 35 degrees below zero, with wind chills dropping into the lethal -60s. Abigail walked to her large, south-facing A-frame window and looked out. The sky, usually a piercing high-altitude blue, had bruised into a heavy, sickly shade of charcoal. The pine trees bordering her property were completely still, an eerie, breathless silence that old mountain residents called the holding. The earth was holding its breath before the strike. Her satellite phone buzzed. It was Sheriff Brody Hayes calling from the valley. "Abby, it's Brody. You seeing this forecast?" The connection was already garbled, thick with static. "I'm seeing it, Sheriff. Looks like a big one." "It's not just a big one, Abby. We're pulling the plows off the pass at 4 p.m. The state is closing Highway 550 entirely. If you're staying up there, you need to know you are completely on your own for at least 3 to 4 days. We cannot get rescue crews up Red Mountain in a whiteout. Do you have enough propane for the generator?" Abigail glanced at her supplies. "I've got propane, I've got food, and I've got enough firewood in my living room to outlast the Ice Age." Brody sighed through the static. "All right. Keep the taps dripping so your pipes don't burst. Hunker down. We'll check the radio frequencies at noon every day." The line went dead. Abigail set the phone down. A sudden, deep rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin. It wasn't thunder. It was the wind cresting the mountain ridge above her, roaring like a phantom freight train. 5 minutes later, the sky unleashed. By 8 p.m., the concept of a world outside had ceased to exist. Abigail's cabin was entirely swallowed by a blinding, shrieking whiteout. The snow wasn't falling. It was firing horizontally like buckshot against the heavy timber walls of the A-frame. Inside, Abigail had the wood stove roaring. The thick cast iron radiated a comforting, dry heat, pushing the interior temperature to a cozy 70 degrees. She sat in her armchair, sipping chamomile tea, knitting a thick sweater, and listening to the apocalyptic roar outside. She felt a smug sense of validation looking at her indoor woodpile. She didn't have to brave the lethal wind to keep the fire going. Then, at 9:14 p.m., the lights flickered, surged brightly for a terrifying second, and died. The sudden darkness was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Abigail froze, her knitting needles clinking together in the blackness. The ambient hum of the refrigerator ceased, leaving only the violent screaming of the wind. The localized power grid, notoriously fragile in the San Juans, had catastrophically failed. "Okay," Abigail whispered to herself, her heart rate spiking. "Just the generator. I just need to start the generator." She clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark. Her backup power was a reliable standby generator housed in a small lean-to shed attached to the back kitchen door. She pulled on her insulated coveralls, gloves, and a heavy parka, bracing herself before turning the deadbolt. When she opened the back door, the pressure differential nearly knocked her off her feet. A wall of snow collapsed inward, burying her boots. The cold hit her face like a physical blow, a shocking, immediate numbness that felt like burning acid. She shoved her way into the small lean-to. The wind had ripped the protective tarp away, packing the generator's exhaust and intake vents with rock-hard, wind-driven ice. Desperately, she clawed at the ice, chipping her fingernails through her gloves. She primed the engine and pulled the ripcord. Cough, sputter. Nothing. She pulled again, putting her back into it. The cord snapped back, lifeless. The fuel lines, exposed to the sudden, drastic plunge in temperature, had already frozen solid. The moisture in the carburetor had crystallized. The generator was a dead piece of metal. Defeated and shivering violently after only 3 minutes of exposure, Abigail wrestled the back door shut, leaning her entire body weight against it to engage the deadbolt. "Fine," she gasped, stripping off her snow-caked gloves. "No electricity. That's fine. I have the wood stove. I'll just ride it out by the fire." She walked back into the living room, the beam of her flashlight illuminating the massive triangular window that made up the front of the A-frame. The glass was flexing inward, vibrating under the immense atmospheric pressure. At 11:30 p.m., the storm delivered its fatal blow. High above the cabin, a massive 70-foot ponderosa pine, weakened by years of beetle rot and pushed beyond its structural limits by the 90-mile-per-hour gusts, violently snapped in half. Abigail heard the crack, a sound like a cannon firing right outside her door. She only had time to dive behind the kitchen island before a 1,000-pound, ice-laden branch crashed completely through the upper half of the A-frame's massive front window. The sound of shattering double-paned glass was deafening, immediately swallowed by the explosive roar of the blizzard invading her home. The heavy branch tore through the living room, smashing the coffee table into splinters and stopping just inches from the roaring wood stove. In a fraction of a second, the sanctuary of the cabin was destroyed. The negative 40-degree wind poured through the massive, jagged hole in the facade. Snow blasted into the room, instantly coating the rugs, the furniture, and the walls in a layer of white frost. Abigail screamed, the sound whipped away by the wind. She scrambled to her feet, shining her flashlight at the devastation. The hole was enormous, at least 6 feet wide and 4 feet high, positioned awkwardly halfway up the A-frame wall. The heat from the wood stove was sucked out of the room instantly. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet at a terrifying rate. Within 2 minutes, she could see her breath pluming thickly in the air. The water in the dog bowl on the floor was already forming a skin of ice. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. If she didn't plug that hole, the ambient temperature inside would equalize with the outside within the hour. She would freeze to death in her own living room long before dawn. She ran to the hall closet, dragging out blankets, sheets, and towels, desperately trying to staple them across the jagged glass perimeter. But the wind was too violent. It ripped the heavy wool blankets out of her hands as if they were tissue paper, sending them flying into the dark corners of the room. Wood from the broken branch blocked her from boarding it up properly, and the sheer force of the gale made it impossible to maneuver heavy plywood, even if she had any. Think, Abby, think. Her flashlight beam swept wildly across the room, landing on the towering stack of split firewood, and then on the massive, bulging burlap sacks of raw wool. An idea, born of sheer desperation and survival instinct, struck her. Wool was one of nature's greatest insulators, and raw fleece, still slick with lanolin grease, was naturally windproof and water-resistant. She grabbed her heavy leather work gloves. The jagged shards of glass still clinging to the window frame were a severe laceration hazard. She began with the firewood. Straining her muscles, she dragged the heaviest oak logs from her indoor stack, carrying them 2 by 2 toward the shattered window. The branch that had crashed through was wedged against the floor, acting as a bizarre makeshift scaffolding. Abigail began stacking the heavy firewood directly on top of the branch, creating a dense, heavy wooden dam across the lower half of the gaping hole. The wind fought her, biting through her parka, freezing the tears on her eyelashes. Her fingers went numb, moving with sluggish, agonizing slowness. But she kept stacking. Log after log, she built a heavy, immovable wooden barricade, using the sheer weight of her indoor woodpile to fight the pressure of the wind. Once the wooden barricade was about 3 feet high, she turned to the wool. The burlap sacks weighed nearly 40 pounds each. She dragged the first sack across the freezing floor, hoisting it up and shoving it violently into the jagged upper gap of the broken window, resting it on the newly built wooden dam. The wind howled, trying to push the sack back into the room. Abigail threw her body weight against it, pinning it in place. She screamed in exertion, reaching behind her to drag a second sack, then a third. She jammed the tightly packed wool fleeces into every crevice, every jagged hole, using them like giant insulated sandbags. The greasy lanolin in the raw wool acted as a natural sealant, repelling the blowing snow. Because the sacks were soft and malleable, she could force them to conform perfectly to the uneven, broken edges of the glass, and the intruding pine branch. She layered the sacks too deep, reinforcing them from behind with more heavy firewood to keep the wind from blowing them inward. 45 minutes later, exhausted, bruised, and bleeding from a small cut on her cheek where a piece of flying glass had grazed her, Abigail stepped back. The howling shriek of the wind dropped to a muffled, distant roar. The snow stopped blasting into her face. She had built a massive, 6-foot-thick plug of oak, cedar, and greasy sheep's fleece. The hole was sealed. Abigail collapsed onto the floor in front of the wood stove, trembling violently as the adrenaline began to crash. She threw 3 more logs into the fire, watching the flames roar back to life. She had survived the breach, but as she stared at her makeshift barricade, she realized the nightmare was only just beginning. The storm was projected to last for 3 more days. The power was gone, and the structural integrity of her roof was now compromised by the massive tree still resting against it. The wool and firewood had saved her life tonight, but the real test of endurance lay in the freezing darkness ahead. For the next 48 hours, time inside the cabin ceased to be measured by clocks. It was measured entirely by the consumption of oak, the melting of snow, and the creeping, insidious boundary of the frost line. By the morning of the second day, the interior of the A-frame had become a surreal, terrifying ice cave. The massive barricade of raw wool and split firewood was holding back the lethal 90-mile-per-hour winds, but it could not stop the ambient cold from seeping through the uninsulated walls and the floorboards. The temperature in the far corners of the living room hovered at a dangerous 5 degrees above zero. The only habitable zone was a 10-foot radius directly in front of the cast-iron wood stove. Abigail had dragged her mattress down from the loft, positioning it as close to the radiating iron as she dared without igniting the fabric. She lived in a cocoon of down sleeping bags, wearing 3 layers of wool sweaters, insulated snow pants, and a thick fleece balaclava. The psychological toll began to mirror the physical exhaustion. The wind never stopped. It didn't just howl, it possessed a physical weight, a low, continuous, vibrating roar that rattled Abigail's teeth and made it impossible to sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. It sounded like a massive, angry beast, endlessly circling the cabin, probing for weaknesses. Every few hours, she was forced to emerge from her sleeping bags to feed the fire. This was where her eccentric indoor hoarding truly became her salvation. If she had been forced to open the back door to retrieve wood from an exterior shed, the blast of negative 40-degree wind would have stripped the remaining heat from the cabin in seconds. Worse, she likely would have succumbed to exposure just trying to dig the logs out of the drifts. Instead, she merely had to army crawl to the remaining stack against the western wall, pull a few heavy splits of cedar, and shove them into the glowing embers. "You're building a fortress of garbage, Abby." Her ex-husband Richard's voice echoed in her mind, a phantom memory triggered by the isolation and the cold. He had hated her messy, tactile hobbies. He had hated the smell of the unwashed wool, claiming it made the house smell like a barn. "Well, Richard," Abigail whispered, through chapped, bleeding lips, staring at the massive wall of greasy fleece currently plugging a 6-foot hole in her living room, "the barn is keeping me alive." The raw wool was performing a miracle of primitive engineering. The heavy lanolin grease coating the Navajo churro fleeces had actually frozen solid upon contact with the invading blizzard, creating an impenetrable, wind-proof crust on the exterior side of the barricade. Inside, the dense pockets of trapped air within the wool fibers provided a massive layer of thermal insulation. But survival was a game of brutal attrition, and Abigail was losing ground. By the evening of the 3rd day, her water pipes had frozen solid and burst. She heard the sharp, metallic crack beneath the floorboards, though there was no water pressure left to flood the house. To stay hydrated, she was forced to scoop snow from the edges of the broken window, melting it down in a cast-iron Dutch oven on top of the wood stove. The melted snow tasted flat and metallic, coated with a fine layer of soot from the back drafts that occasionally puffed out of the stovepipe when the wind violently shifted. Her body ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Her hands were covered in minor cuts and burns from tending the fire in the dark, and her toes felt thick and rubbery, the early warning signs of frostnip. She constantly wiggled them inside her boots, terrified of losing circulation. At 2 a.m. on the fourth night, a new crisis emerged. The wind abruptly shifted direction, slamming directly into the eastern face of the roof. The massive ponderosa pine branch that was wedged through the broken window groaned under the shifting atmospheric pressure. With a sickening crunch, the branch shifted inward by 6 inches. The movement dislodged the top layer of Abigail's wool barricade. Instantly, a jet of freezing, powder-fine snow blasted through the new gap, hitting Abigail directly in the face. The temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Panic, raw and jagged, spiked through her exhaustion. She threw off her sleeping bags and scrambled toward the breach. She grabbed her heavy leather gloves, grabbed another 40-pound burlap sack of wool from her remaining stash, and threw her weight against the shifting branch. "No, you don't get in!" she screamed at the storm, her voice cracking. She shoved the fresh sack into the gap, but the wind pressure was too intense. It pushed back, threatening to collapse the entire upper half of her makeshift dam. She needed leverage. Scanning the dark room with her flashlight, her eyes landed on the heavy, solid oak dining table. It weighed nearly 200 pounds. Operating on pure, desperate adrenaline, Abigail wedged her back against the table and leg-pressed it across the floor, inch by agonizing inch, until it was flush against the barricade. She tipped it upward, using the flat tabletop to press the wool sacks firmly against the jagged glass and the intruding branch, locking it into place with the remaining pile of indoor firewood. She collapsed against the table, gasping for air, her lungs burning from the frigid intake. The gap was sealed again. The draft stopped. She curled back up on her mattress, weeping silent, exhausted tears into her balaclava. She didn't know how much more she could take. She had enough wood for perhaps one more day. If the storm didn't break by tomorrow, the fire would die, and she would quickly follow. Abigail woke to a sound that terrified her more than the roaring gale. It was absolute, heavy silence. She bolted upright on her mattress. The wood stove was nothing but a bed of low, glowing orange coals. The air in the cabin was painfully cold, her breath hanging in thick white clouds. She scrambled to her feet and looked toward the upper loft windows, expecting to see the bruised grey light of morning. Instead, she saw nothing but pitch blackness. She checked her battery-powered watch. It was 9:30 a.m. on Friday. The sun should have been up for hours. Confused and panicked, she grabbed her flashlight and shined it up at the loft windows. The glass wasn't broken. It was completely pressed flush with a solid, impenetrable wall of white. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The wind hadn't just stopped. It had buried her. The topography of her property, combined with the massive drifts created by the blizzard, had effectively swallowed the A-frame whole. The snow was packed all the way up to the second-story roofline. She was entombed. Abigail ran to the back kitchen door. She threw the deadbolt and pulled. The door opened exactly 2 inches before hitting a solid wall of packed, icy snow. The lean-to structure housing her dead generator had completely collapsed under the weight of the drift, creating a compacted barrier of lumber and ice. Okay, don't panic," she muttered aloud, her voice sounding muffled and dead in the buried cabin. "You have to dig. You just have to dig up. She couldn't dig through the front barricade. Moving the wool and the heavy branch would collapse the structural integrity of the damaged wall. Her only option was the back door. She found a flat-edged fireplace shovel and an iron fire poker. She bundled up in her remaining dry layers, wedged herself into the 2-inch gap of the back door, and began to chip away at the ice block. It was agonizing, claustrophobic work. The snow was packed so tightly by the wind that it possessed the density of concrete. She used the iron poker to fracture the ice, then used the small shovel to scoop the debris backward into her kitchen. Hour after hour, she dug a narrow, upward-sloping tunnel. She worked in near-total darkness, her flashlight propped on a kitchen chair behind her. The physical exertion kept her warm, but the lack of oxygen in the buried tunnel began to make her dizzy and nauseous. By 2 p.m., she had tunneled nearly 8 feet diagonally upward, pulling the collapsed lumber of the lean-to out of her way. Her shoulders screamed in agony. Her gloves were soaked through, and her fingers were completely numb. Suddenly, her iron poker broke through something soft. A shaft of piercing, blindingly bright sunlight hit her directly in the eye. Abigail gasped, dropping the poker. She used her heavily gloved hands to claw at the hole, widening it frantically. The snow gave way, crumbling down around her shoulders. She pushed her head and torso through the opening, taking a massive, gasping breath of impossibly crisp, freezing mountain air. The world outside was unrecognizable. The familiar jagged peaks of the San Juans were buried under a smooth, terrifyingly pristine blanket of blinding white. The pine trees surrounding her property were heavily bowed, many snapped in half like the one currently resting inside her living room. Then she heard it. The high-pitched mechanical whine of 2-stroke engines echoing up the valley. Abigail hauled herself completely out of the tunnel, standing waist-deep in the surface powder. She waved her arms frantically, screaming until her throat tore. "Here! Over here!" 2 bright yellow county search and rescue snowmobiles crested the ridge, throwing up massive rooster tails of powder. The lead rider spotted her and immediately banked hard toward the cabin, cutting the engine as he approached. Sheriff Brody Hayes leaped off the sled, trudging through the waist-deep snow. Behind him was Tom Abernathy, looking pale and deeply shaken. "Abby!" Brody yelled, grabbing her by the shoulders to steady her. "Good God, you're alive. We couldn't even see the roof line from the road. We thought the house had collapsed." Tom waded up behind him, staring in disbelief at the massive crater Abigail had just crawled out of. "Abby, your front window. The tree." "I know," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. She was shaking violently, now that the adrenaline was leaving her system. "Branch came through the first night." Brody frowned, pulling a heavy thermal blanket from his pack and wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. "How did you keep from freezing to death? If the front window blew out, the wind chill would have killed you in an hour." Abigail managed a weak, exhausted smile. She pointed a trembling, frost-nipped finger back down into the dark tunnel she had just excavated. "I built a wall." 10 minutes later, Brody and Tom had cleared enough snow from the tunnel to squeeze inside the dark, freezing cabin. The beams of their tactical flashlights swept across the devastation. The shattered glass, the frost-covered furniture, the massive pine branch dominating the room. And then their lights settled on the barricade. Tom let out a low, stunned whistle. There, wedged flawlessly into the jagged opening of the A-frame, was a 6-foot-thick fortress. Dozens of burlap sacks, bulging with frozen, grease-caked sheep's wool, were stacked with architectural precision, heavily reinforced from behind by cords of split oak and an upended dining room table. Brody walked up to the wool, pressing a gloved hand against the rock-hard, frozen lanolin crust. He turned back to look at Abigail, who was sitting near the fading embers of the wood stove, clutching a thermos of hot tea Tom had brought. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom muttered, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He looked at Abigail, his eyes wide with newfound respect. "I take back every word I said, Abby. That rodent hotel just saved your life." The Red Mountain blizzard of 2026 became local legend, but for Abigail Fletcher, it was a brutal vindication. Her eccentric hoard of raw wool and split cedar hadn't just been a quirky hobby, it was the exact alchemy required to cheat death. She never rebuilt the front window perfectly. Instead, she left a section of the massive cedar branch exposed, a permanent, physical monument to the night the storm tried to break her, and failed.